Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
India is the world's largest democracy, and it has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. When the country took a loan from the International Monetary Fund in the 1990s, it opened its economy to the forces of the market. The neoliberal economic reforms created a lot of wealth, but it left out the poor. Over a third of India's population still lives below the poverty line. Sarbeswar Sahoo is assistant professor for sociology at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. In his talk, he explains how the failure of the economic reforms to benefit the poor has given rise to several counter-movements. Reactionary, reformist, welfarist, and political movements all try to make the poor benefit from India's growth. Sarbeswar Sahoo received a travel grant from the Volkswagen Foundation to give his talk at the Herrenhausen conference Rethinking Social Inequality in Hanover, Germany on May 13, 2014. The title of Sahoo's talk is Market Liberalism, Marginalized Citizens, and the Counter-Movements in India.
What I'll be doing is that basically to talk about the India story, and particularly from the 1990s, I'll tell you that what has happened to India from the 1990s when India took the International Monetary Fund, IMF's loan, and tried to liberalize its economy and opened up its economy to the market forces. And what this paper is particularly trying to understand is that it is trying to talk about the implications that neoliberal economic reforms has had on the Indian context. And particularly, I'm trying to address two basic questions. The first question is that how have neoliberal reforms or policies have transformed the economic structures and policies in India? And the second question, which is that what kind of implications, political and economic implications, these reform policies have had on the poor and marginalized populations in India. And how I'm going to do that is that I'm taking the theoretical framework that has been provided by Karl Polanyi in his great book, which is called The Great Transformation, published in 1944. And what I'm trying to talk about is that this is the basic argument I'm making. I'm saying that market reforms, particularly the neoliberal reforms, has created a lot of wealth for India. And this wealth have had different kinds of implications for different classes of Indian society. And particularly, there has been arguments that, the poor people have not been actually that much benefited from these reforms. And what I'm trying to say is that since the poor people have not been benefited much from these reforms, these have actually mobilized them. The poor people have mobilized because of these adverse implications that these reforms have had on them. And they try to mobilize themselves to re-embed the market, which Polanyi was talking about, into state and societal forces. And what I argue is that while the longer-term outcomes of such mobilization of the poor people and the marginalized population is quite unclear, we don't know where it is going to go, but it is sure that, this kind of mobilization, what I call the counter-movements, and Polanyi was also talking about counter-movements, have expanded the public policy and has had some kind of significant implications in policy making. And this is the theory of Polanyi's double movement, and what he was trying to do is that basically provide a powerful critique of the market liberalism or the reforms that markets have heard. And what he was trying to talk about is that self-regulating market, when you liberalize the market, it creates a lot of wealth for the society. And when you liberalize the market becomes liberalized, and it becomes actually disembedded from the state and from the societal structures. And as a result of this kind of disembedment of the market, it creates a lot of dislocations for the people, for the poor and marginalized groups. And what happens is that because of this disembedment, the poor people are very much adversely affected by the market forces. And as a response to this disembedment, the poor people actually mobilize themselves and try to create protectionist movements, which is called the counter-protectionist counter-movements against the market and the state. And what Polanyi was trying to talk about is that this kind of, disembedment and the re-embedment of market, you could call as kind of double movement. And what I will try to show is that how India's transition from a state-led, welfare-oriented state to a market-led economy has broken down the protective measures and given rise to different kinds of counter-movements and try to re-embed the market into the social and state structure. I'll give you a brief history of what has happened when India became independent in the 1947. From the 1947 till roughly till 1980s, the state followed a kind of what you could call, the nature of the state was largely what we call not welfare state, but welfare-oriented state. It was basically trying to talk about the poor people's rights and their welfare. And the Indian constitution tried to guarantee some of these rights and welfare measures for the poor people. The fundamental rights in the constitution guaranteed the equality and liberty of the individuals, and the directive principles in the Indian constitution was also trying to make sure that the poor people and those people who are deprived get compulsory education for their children. They promote education and economic interests of the scheduled caste, which is the lower caste of Indian society, the scheduled tribes, which are also the indigenous peoples of India, the landless poor, and provide the state makes sure that these people actually get the basic minimum economic services by the state. And people have talked about that actually from 1950s to 1980s, how the state actually acted like a kind of benevolent Leviathan and tried to provide different kinds of public goods and social services to the people. And people have also talked about that the 1950s to the 1980s, the Indian state, which is called the Nehruvian state broadly, acted as a kind of protector, modernizer, and liberator for the people. And there has been also counter stories, but this is broadly the thing. And if you look at the economic policies that the state followed during this time, it has actually been what we call the mixed economic policies, largely mix of agriculture and industrial policies. There was not much actually export-oriented policies. Largely, it was import substitution policies that Indian state followed. And what happened because of this kind of inward-looking mixed policies is that Indian economy actually slowed down. There was not much growth. The growth rate was around 3.5% roughly in this period, which has been actually characterized as what you call Hindu rate of growth. And because of this kind of slow growth, Indian economy actually faced a balance of payment crisis in the 1990s particularly. And as a result of this balance of payment crisis, the Indian economy was forced to open up. It did not have any other choice. And 1990s was particularly crucial for Indian state and society. And what happened in the 1990s is that Indian state opened up to the international market forces. And what happened is that the market liberalism, the opening of the market, actually created a lot of growth and a lot of wealth for India. Indian state made a transition from the state-led, welfare-oriented economic policy to a more kind of capitalistic, more open market-oriented policies from the 1990s onwards. And if you look at the industrial policies, what happened is that India made a transition from kind of import substitution policies to export-led growth policies it followed. And India, as Indian economy opened up, what happened is that the foreign capital also came in. It invited multinational companies, reduced import tariffs, and effectively sought foreign investment. And Indian economy actually grew much faster, and you see that Indian economy from 2000 onwards actually grew around 9 to 10%. And because of this, actually, Indian economy has created a lot of wealth and all these things that you can see. I don't really have much time. And what I'll talk about is that it also created a lot of problems for the poor people particularly. And what happened is that the reforms benefited the rich and adversely affected the poor people. And people have said that, the liberalization has lifted many boats, but not all. And poverty actually still continued to be one of the major factors. Almost 30% of India's population live below the poverty line. And India's unemployment has also risen during the reform period from the 1990s, if you compare it to recent data. And we see that the welfare-oriented state also has declined its investment in health, in education, and other kinds of welfare policies. And the urban-centric growth has neglected the agricultural sector. The falling commodity prices and the rising input costs has led to a lot of actually farmer suicides. And data shows that more than 150,000 farmers have actually committed suicides from the 1990s onwards. And we see that different kinds of international and multinational companies are coming into India and investing in different parts of the country, which has also created a lot of dislocations and involuntary displacements, right? What I say is that because of this kind of dislocations and decline of the welfare state, there has been actually, I would say that 4 kind of counter movements which has opened up, which have emerged in Indian society. And the first one is what I call reactionary movement. Second one is reformist movement. Third one is welfarist or developmental movement. Fourth one is political movements. And all these are not necessarily actually the boundaries between these movements are quite blurred. You can't really separate from, but I'll just make this point. The first kind of movement, which is reactionary movement, they have arisen as a response to the exclusivist and exploitative politics of the state and the market. And this has happened because of 2 reasons. The first one is that the neoliberal policies have withdrawn or have forced the state to withdraw from different kinds of welfare services. And the second one is that actually the neoliberal policies have also created a lot of displacement, loss of livelihood, and community living for the poor people. And as a result of that, I would talk about, maybe I'll talk about it in the discussion, there is a policy which has been created by the state of India called the Special Economic Zones Act 2005, which has increased this process of dislocations and displacement in Indian context. And you see that large number of movements have come up against the neoliberal policies of the Indian state and the market. Not all these movements have been successful, but they have actually have had significant influence on the policies of Indian state and market. The second one is what I call the reformist movement, and the reformist movement includes various advocacy groups, largely NGOs, social activists, intellectuals, middle class, social movements, and these kind of people. What they try to do is that they try to make growth, what has been happening from the 1990s, make growth more inclusive, more human, and more sustainable. And what they try to do is that they see that they are mostly influenced by the right-based and distributive politics. And what they try to say is that the reforms have largely benefited the growth, benefited the rich. So we need to actually shift the agenda and try to make it actually towards more pro-poor and more things. And you can see that lot of these movements, because of these reformist movements, because of these movements by the middle class, by the poor people, by the NGOs, lot of these pro-poor acts has been passed by the government and which has been implemented also in different parts of India. The Right to Information Act, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which provides 100 days compulsory employment to the rural households. And you see that every year India creates 50 million jobs for women and men in rural society. The third movement I talk about is the welfarist movement or welfare-oriented movement, which is largely created by the NGOs and developmental organizations. And what they try to do is that they see that the capacity of the state is quite limited and they try to complement the role of the state in Indian society. And you see that there are actually more than 1.5 million NGOs which have been working, and this is actually quite underestimated number. It's actually a huge number, and you see that they have been working on different areas like religious, community social services, education, health, sports, and different kinds of activities they have been working on. So these also play an important role in recent days for the pro-poor policies and things. The last one, which is what I call the political movements and what David Brady was talking about in the morning, which is this is actually the formal sphere in the sphere of electoral politics. And what happens is that this has actually manifested in 2 ways. The first one you can see is that increasing number of poor people, low-caste people, tribal people, women, Muslims, these marginalized groups are increasingly participating in the electoral politics, and they think that there is a stake, and they think that it is only through electoral politics that they can influence policies and redistribute resources. They are increasingly participating in electoral politics. And you see that in recent elections, more than 60% people have actually voted because they think that there is a stake. And the second thing is that, which is that these people, the pro-poor, low-caste, tribal people, not just participating in electoral politics, but also creating new political parties and directly participating, directly actually participating in the electoral politics. And you see that there is a significant change from 1970s to 1990s. So what I conclude from all this thing is that you see that 1950s to 1980s, the state was a largely welfare-oriented state, and the market was largely governed by the state, and the state was making sure that the market does not become too exploitative for the poor people, right? And this happened. There was a significant shift in the 1990s. The state declined, the welfare-oriented measures also declined, and the market became more and more self-regulating. And because of this self-regulating market, there has been actually large amount of dislocations, displacements, loss of community living in the different parts of the country. And because as a response to all these kinds of dislocations, different kinds of counter-movements have come up. And these counter-movements, what I conclude is that although they have not been quite successful in overturning the neoliberal tide, and I don't think they will be able to actually overturn the neoliberal tide, but they have certainly influenced the policy priorities of the Indian state and the Indian market. Thank you.